Welcome to the University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the international research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. The project is conducted in collaboration with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of their Art Seeking Understanding program. In this seminar, recorded on the 3rd of April, Professor Anna Foka, Director of the Center for Digital Humanities and Social Sciences in Uppsala, gives the lowdown on the possibilities and problems associated with recent advances in artificial intelligence in relation to cultural artifacts. Professor Foka argues for a cautious optimism in relation to AI, where the quality of machine decision-making is shown to be closely tied to the quality of the data and the parameters selected for classification. Using cultural heritage collections as an example, Foka discusses how AI offers new opportunities for access and engagement, but also risks perpetuating historical biases embedded in these collections.
Welcome, everyone. I'm going to introduce Anna Foka, who doesn't need much of an introduction. She's been part of this project since its inception. She gave a presentation during the first period of the project. She has been absolutely essential to the project by helping philosophers understand what the digital humanities are and how to engage in digital humanities research. Natural language analysis is a huge part of our project of critical texts from a huge variety of traditions, and Anna has been absolutely instrumental in helping us think through what this part of the project amounts to and how to conduct this research. Anna is the director of the Center for Digital Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. Of course, her research and teaching focuses on applications of information technology for the arts and humanities, and she's done especially interesting work, at least for the interest of this project, at the intersection of digital humanities and museum studies. I don't know if that's how you would describe it, Anna, but that's what it looks like to a philosopher. Really interesting work on the nature of museums and digital applications to curatorial studies and history of art. She's received way too many grants, too many to name here. She's currently PI on a project, AI Authenticity and Archives, from which today's talk, I suspect, is drawn. The title of her presentation today is Synthetic Past: Critical Perspectives on AI for the Archives, Libraries, and Museum Sectors. Anna, thank you very much for joining us today.
I feel overwhelmed with this incredible introduction, and I'm really grateful that you think this way. And I think that the philosopher's way of seeing my work is extremely wonderful, and I have no real words to sort of like respond on that. I will try to share my screen so we can move on. I should say that I'm really happy to present today, even though it's really good weather outside and it probably won't last. So this is our last chance of running out after this talk, but hopefully I hope it will make some sense, and I hope it will be inspiring. I should also say that I've been trying to sort of look a little bit at the work of the Aesthetic Cognitivism project, and especially the work that the research engineers are doing, and it's extremely impressive. And I hope that this is not precisely about the project, what I will present today, but I'm hoping that it can generate some questions about it and how we handle our data. I should also make a couple of disclaimers, for example, like full disclosure that this is some thoughts, and I don't quite have the answers for these problems that I will address, but I'm basically addressing the problems and a way of thinking when we work with artificial intelligence and historical documents and artifacts, which is actually what I'm very passionate about. So I will give you like a small summary of what I will talk about. And I always have this Søren Kierkegaard, I realize. I think it's because I'm talking to philosophers so much these days that I always have this slight comic that says that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. I'm not sure how to... The way I relate to this is that I'm a historian by training, and I always think there's so much hidden gold in historical materials, and the way to sort of discover it, perhaps technology is not the solution to everything, but it has the potential. And in my line of work, I like to focus on possibilities and see if they are possible and what are the possibilities and how can we reach to that point. So personally, at the moment, I do not have any concern that AI is going to take our jobs personally, but I can see why people think this way. I also see how it is overhyped in many ways. So today, my plan is to speak about simulation and AI as both a technology and a set of narratives about what it can do. And then focus on sort of applications on AI and heritage, and what sort of like what is the European sort of dialectics on the subject, like what does the European Commission think it can actually do. Then I will try to bring some examples from my own previous research into this, and why it didn't quite work always, or what can we learn from implementation. How can we think with technology, if I was to paraphrase Levi Strauss, and his thoughts on animals. Thinking with animals are good to think with, and technology is also good to think with, but it's not an animal, but maybe it is. And then moving towards inclusive AI imaginaries, and how can we perhaps harness this power, and what needs to be done in order to think with technology, and thinking about the fair and care principles that we should have in terms of heritage. So, I mean, it's quite interesting. I was right now at the symposium at the Swedish Collegium of Advanced Study, and one of the discussions that we had is that, oh, wow, everybody on social media is actually making themselves into Studio Ghibli characters. I mean, now we have programs that can harness enormous amounts of power, but the first thing sort of the wide audiences do with a capital A is to turn themselves into Ghibli characters. What does this say about sort of the power that we have, and how did we get to this? And I think part of the reason why AI is trending, because looking at sort of international journals that are well sort of established that deal with AI and humanities and social sciences, I mean, they've been there since the 1970s. AI has been there before, but why is everybody talking about it right now? Well, I think there's two reasons. I would say that one is the very, very rapid development, obviously, which is, as with most cases, based on other sort of industries that perhaps are not part of our present talk, preliminary military, but also the sex industry that has been developing these things. On the other hand, is that ever since the 90s, we have, and especially the end of 90s, there is a lot of data that is being digitized. A lot of everything is sort of, there was for quite a long period of time, especially between the 90s and the nowadays, if you like, that there has been very valiant attempts on digitizing historical documents and sort of creating a digital transformation of those sectors, among, of course, other sectors, but particularly in the heritage sector. And there has been a lot of resources, for example, Europeana, as an example, that have tried to sort of categorize, classify, put things online, try to make things accessible. And there's a very famous paper by Prescott and Hughes from 2018, if I remember well, that says that, okay, we digitize, but is this meant to make things easier for us to find? Is it meant to democratize knowledge? And what can we do with that? But having all these huge amounts of data also means that if we have a parallel development of AI technologies, the way to fine-tune and support that development is by feeding algorithms huge amounts of data, and we have that. So this sort of like created this paradox where people think, and generally everybody, we have mixed feelings about it. Some people say, I mean, that's a meme, obviously, right? That GPT-5 confirmed to confidently try to complete 11 tasks simultaneously, then email you 6 months later explaining it's had a mental breakdown. When, a lot of people spoke about, having PhD level intelligence, that we will be able to replace some of the dull tasks that we do, that if you want someone to annotate, for example, historical photography, you could just put things in and it will come out perfectly. And none of this is true. I mean, we're not there yet. I'm sure there is a timeline to what we can do, but it's not as simple. And the reason for that is, I would say, both existential, epistemological, and technological. And of course, everybody's using to some extent technologies. And this is a little video I have, which I think was very interesting. And I think it may or may not appeal to philosophers. I'm actually hoping for that it will appeal to philosophers. But I'm an AI mentor between South Korea and Sweden. So we have a group of scholars, young scholars, PhD to assistant professors, postdocs from all over Sweden and all over South Korea. And we meet once a year. And now we have these mobility programs and all of that. And in one of those occasions in South Korea, in Seoul, we went to labs that actually work with AI. And it was very interesting because you realize that, AI is used for everything. So, for example, you cannot use Google Maps in South Korea, not the least in Seoul where we were. I'm not sure about other places because Naver, which is the sort of South Korean response to Google, is charting all the maps. So, they can sort of create automatic vehicles that are powered by AI. So they have all the mapping responsibility. And of course, there is always the complexity with North Korea. So in one of those meetings in the Korea University lab, which is basically the equivalent, the South Korean equivalent of, Uppsala and Lund or Oxford and Cambridge, or it's sort of one of the best universities, we came across this experiment. So this is basically military technology dog, a developed animal that is meant to sort of not to replace drones in the borders. And of course, it's a little bit easier because it's not detectable. It mimics animal movement. But in this particular case, the PhD students in the sort of AI lab in Korea University have been training it to be a pet. And this was the result. This is a very, very heavy machine. It's not particularly nice to see. A lot of us that were there felt really uncomfortable looking at this. And I think a lot of people that work with robotics in particular, I mean, the actual material dimensions of having a thing that if it stomps on you, I mean, probably you need to go to the hospital as a pet was not a pleasant choice. So I think in this sense, it has been sort of AI in many ways. I mean, we use it. All of us use Siri, and a lot of us are using recommender systems. People in the heritage fields are actually using other tools as well. And today, I think what I will try to talk about a little bit is sort of simulating the work of the curator. What does the curator do when they have to classify and categorize pictures? And in this particular case, I will focus on what can it do. And I would like to quote the author of the Atlas of AI, which is Kate Crawford. She actually says at some point that artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor intelligent because, I mean, it's made by humans and it's still not perfect, as humans are not perfect. In a way, if we think of it in theological terms, like a mirror image of humanity, it can sort of simulate a curator. Perhaps, yes, but what I always give as an example is this particular picture that you see on your right-hand side is actually a picture from my own household. We have pet lizards, or we had pet lizards. Now we only have one. And at some point they started having babies, which was really stressful for us because we got all of these baby lizards. And at some point we started, having those little lizards at home. And then, the eggs started sort of hatching. And we took a lot of pictures because it was exciting. We have a small person in the house as well, our daughter. So it was very, very exciting for us. However, as you know, our phones have some sort of automatic classification system of pictures, and particularly iOS, sometimes if you have used it, comes up with your little cute compilations, a day in Visby or, a weekend in Berlin, and sort of puts everything together. Now, the classification of this particular picture in my iOS somehow made it to meals at home. But of course, we did not eat those eggs. So that is an example of a bad classification that happened automatically. And we were wondering, how could this be meals at home? I mean, this is obviously perhaps there is a culture where, where the data set is trained. I mean, it's very hard to know when algorithms work on top of one another, and especially when it comes to iOS sort of automation, because Apple is very strong on security. It's very difficult to know how the algorithms worked on top of one another, but in some training set, this is what happened. And here we are, baby lizards as meals at home. So when it comes to sort of the work of the curators, I mean, I would like to focus on one particular type of technology, or perhaps two, and that's computer vision. But essentially, how autonomous are these autonomous systems? So if we say that there is a general artificial intelligence, which, some tasks are automated, then there is machine learning, where with not explicit sort of programming, the machine can pick for itself. And then it's very good. It works really well with really good structured data. So if you have a very structured sort of like data set that says that this could be described as a photograph and it's very standardized, then it's very easy for it to pick and sort of categorize accordingly in a way that you prompt it. And then you have deep learning, which works with unstructured data and makes somehow its own decisions to some extent, but it doesn't need any sort of human in the loop. And in this particular case, I think the technologies that we use, at least when it comes, or perhaps the curators use is a better way of putting it, is that they primarily are interested from sort of research that we conducted in computer vision. So computer vision, in a sense, sort of is possible to recognize, to focus on the algorithmic processing of images and videos, using applications like facial recognition or image classification and object detection, which is exactly what this little picture of our lizards sort of showed. That there has been some sort of complexity, but mostly is machine learning and often involves deep learning. So we are at the point where a human can be to some extent in the loop, but not necessarily. So when we talk about heritage, I mean, we have a lot of experts here that have been working with heritage that I recognize, Elizabeth being one of them. So I think I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, but if I were to give a grocery store description of that and how we mean it, I mean, heritage is a lot of things. It could be tangible or intangible. It's a property that is or may be inherited. Heritage denotes everything we suppose has been handed down to us from the past. And of course, it differs greatly among people and over time. Absolutely, we've got this. And then we have this, I mean, I give as an example a landmark in Uppsala, which is the graves of the kings, of the Viking kings. And of course, we have the location, which you see on the top side. And then we have a picture of it that comes from a collection from Upplandsmuseet. But heritage is also the description of this. The way that we describe this particular artifact is not just sort of the hills themselves, but it's also, in a way, it's also the descriptive information that comes to us. And particularly for this talk, I would like to focus a little bit on how we structure information. And I think part of this has to do because if information is structured as we understand it, then there is other possibilities for sort of not necessarily approaching a complete human in the loop approach, but there are possibilities for automation, for making work a little bit better. And now the question is that, does this actually work at all times? I'm sure it is, and we will get into this. So a lot of people say, why heritage? And again, I'm preaching to the choir. I don't think I need to get into specific details, but heritage is important, and it's important because it denotes, it has to do with people's existence and people's identity. And of course, it is the first casualty in war. One example is Palmyra here that has been bombed. And then, of course, the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, which is always a very good example of using AI as well, I think, because in this particular case, there was a discussion of rebuilding them. I mean, UNESCO recognized them and of course, there is always Ukraine, and a lot of really interesting work is being done there when it comes to restoration. But when it comes to Bamiyan Buddhas, the discussion in 2008, it was like, let's rebuild them, because we follow all of these European sort of understandings of heritage and preservation and conservation, which primarily has to do with their material form. But when the Buddhist minority in Afghanistan was approached about this, like, can we rebuild them? What should we do? can we reconstruct them? They said, well, it's not the same thing. Because in Buddhism, it's often that if something is destroyed, then it's destroyed. You cannot rebuild it. The material components of it is what makes it unique. And to some extent, I think other cultures agree in the same way. But what actually happened is that they used photographic and photogrammetry and processing by picking pictures, and then they created holograms using artificial intelligence, which to some extent it was a Chinese group of scholars that did this, and obviously they were Buddhist, but to some way resonated better than trying to reconstruct their physical form, because they were basically in a way reflecting on what was there before. So it wasn't really making a new thing that was material in the same way. So there are all of these little complexities that have to do with culture. And in what I'm trying to say with this example is that, of course, we can think about ways of classifying and categorizing and having a machine doing it, but also there's people that are connected to this heritage and cultures, and that might not be always the best thing. So I think, as I said in the beginning, I don't really have all of the answers. I have perhaps some answers, but a lot of this is a reflection, and perhaps a reflection to how are we going to work with computational methods in the future within the Schellenkens project. But what was very interesting is that AI has been very heavily hyped, especially after the pandemic, within European documents about heritage. For example, in Europeana strategy, it is very, very clear that AI gets a leading role. And in that sense, sort of it becomes, in a way, the European Commission issued several papers between 2020 and 2025, where AI is highlighted multiple times as a means to an end for data quality improvement. And of course, there is numerous success stories there. Preservation is possible, restoration is possible, documentation is possible. Documentation analysis is also possible, depending on what kind of materials we have. They can help with promotion and management. For example, when it comes to changes happening to cultural heritage sites that have to do with climate or armed conflict, and of course, the very well and perhaps standard now practice of handwritten text recognition, which is a way of image analysis. It picks sort of like handskrift, I nearly said. Handwriting, sorry, Swinglish comes out every now and then. Handwriting and sort of transcribes it into printed text, and that's super useful on the one hand. But it's hyped to the point where it's described primarily as something. I mean, especially Frederick Kaplan, the head of Time Machine, which is really much invested in AI as a program, and it's a very huge multi-billion euro program within Europe. That future AI could lead to a powerful new understanding of our world and its long-term patterns. It will act as a simulation engine for possible futures, thus offering a unique advantage to research institutions, decision makers, and businesses. That was the vision up until 2025, but that is easier said than done. So generally, the idea that we have there is that, or at least that the European Commission had there, is that if we put together AI, if we sort of manage expectations, technology, innovation, market forces, and of course, oh, I'm sorry, I went one back. Sorry, I just touched something by accident here. There we go. So if we sort of like that will help us have a global perspective, and it will sort of meet the public expectations. But that is not as easy actually as it is. So Now I have a new project called Synthetic Paths, where we're looking primarily at generative AI, but today I will try to present a couple of things from previous projects that I've been working with. Yes, I think that John was right. The AI archives and authenticity has been part of it, but also sort of the quantifying culture, which also deals with collections, both textual and text image collections of sorts. So the aims were to sort of study the current digitization practices in Sweden and beyond, and look precisely at sort of computer vision and automation. Can we immediately ascribe attributes, automated attributes, to a piece of sort of art or a photograph or something that comes from the past? And looking as well as artificial intelligence and machine learning methods and tools compliance with fair and care data standards. So care has to do with responsibility, fair and sort of participatory practices, and connecting people. Fair has to do with making them findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, whereas care is sort of like dealing with participatory practices to be inclusive and to take responsibility for things. So in this sense, how quantitative AI can be connected to qualitative meaning making in the sense of diversity and inclusion, can this happen? Can we use AI to be more inclusive, rethink, connect artifacts together in that sense? And the purpose, of course, was to look at, collections management and curation, classification and categorization, but also to raise important ethical and practical questions. And of course, to explore the engagement with diversity and inclusion from the perspective of professionals, like how can we accommodate and how can it help? We have done quite a bit of work on this and sort of like highlighting the potential and challenges, and I'll try to sort of summarize them and add additional information from other work that we've done. But one of the most important issues that we have within the sector of heritage altogether, and I guess also in terms of how it's been used at the moment, is that the biggest complexity that we have is that the data that we have that is digitized, because obviously artificial intelligence has to be able to work with digital data sets. Like I'm sure we can work with manual as well, but that is what the curators are interested in. I mean, we have a content management system, we have a collection of whatever. Can we collect? Can we have a description of this collection that is standardized, that is complete to a great extent, could be translated immediately in multiple languages and made available to the public? But the problem is very often that there is already bias in data sets to begin with. There is difficult language, there is mistaken information, and data formats also play a very big role. And the problem is that, for example, Google Arts and Culture has been heavily criticized by my colleagues precisely on the basis that what it picks as an aggregator that uses AI to capture this information. So if you haven't used the platform, if you go in and type, for example, I'm just trying to think of a word, Greek sculptures, right? It will come up with some things. It might not come up with Greek sculptures or Greek style sculptures that are in countries that this is not made available online. So in a way, sort of it amplifies what already is there, as you can see, which is, of course, a lot of countries are not as open with their data as it is, and perhaps for good reason. Other things is that sort of like there is generally a sort of Western world bias in the sense that a lot of the things that we do that are digitized, we have a legacy. I mean, Sweden is very good in digitizing, for example, but then the formats that are now old, because we started the digitization process already in the end of the 90s, if not before. So a lot of these formats are not sort of able to be picked by engines as such. They don't have open APIs, they're not findable. So it sort of perpetuates that in that sense. And the same, of course, happens with generative AI. I mean, most of it is trained on specific data sets and may not have the domain expertise that a human would have, right? So if you ask an AI to draw you a flower pot that will contain, flowers from the region of, I'm not sure, if it's South Africa, it may or may not be able to do that because it may not have this input and these sort of training data sets. It might come up with flowers that are more common in Morocco, for example. And I think that this has been the complexity, is that the problem is that whereas bias is inherent in cultural heritage collections and their digital versions, AI pipelines and the way that it works in classifying or collecting or putting sort of groups of things together, it will simply amplify what already is. And I think this has to do with the fact that data formats are so diverse, there's diverse practices, and there's, of course, limited interconnectivity. So, for example, if you want to pick something like an Apollo Belvedere as an example and try to figure out where it is in the world and ask Google Arts and Culture to find you all of them, it will probably not account for things that are not online. And that's, of course, normal. But then that also means that places and cultures that are already empowered and have a digitization strategy will be more visible than others. And of course, within a global culture, we should be able to account for this silence and at least address it. Another issue is also that the very format of the physical collection, the sort of the attributes of the physical collection might not actually work well with AI or might not work for the purpose. So in our case, I think in the Quantifying Culture project, we decided that we want to work with the Sami collection. But of course, we did not want to do what Laura Jane Smith calls authoritative heritage discourse, which is me, a sort of new Swede, European person, comes in and decides what gender is who in Sami photographic collections. So we thought we use gender as a case study. We connect with the Northern Sami community. We bring in sort of photographers and experts, and we sit down and chart and annotate all of those pictures in a way that then we can feed this data into an algorithm and we can have a really decent data set. So we have all of these incredible workshops. We've learned so much. The colleagues that were Sami scholars were fantastic. There was also the public. And then we turn to the collections and we have this long discussion about how to tell historically gender in Sami communities. And very often the quality of the photographs is so bad that it's not possible to say. When it comes to children, it's not possible to say. But most importantly, a way to tell gender, according to our Sami informants, was that it's colors, the kind of colors that are used. And then we turn to the collections, and the photography is, of course, black and white. So what do? How do you cannot work with that. You have to sit, colorize, annotate. I mean, in a way, it's easier to just gather the sort of the Sami community on a sort of participatory workshop, provided that they're available, and do this work manually. So in that case, it won't help. And then, of course, data quality is very important, and metadata, which is this descriptive information, is also equally important. But what is also important is the infrastructure and the capacity building. And I think in that sense, very often in Sweden, and especially within our study, the organizations that we looked at are funded by the government, which is a wonderful thing. But very often, these people that work in curator positions do not have the possibility to educate themselves in these new technologies, so they don't know where to begin. They have a vague idea. Then, of course, they cannot develop the technology themselves. There is very little time and effort to develop a platform from scratch. So, for example, guardians of Swedish heritage, if I may say, or institutions that are meant to safeguard Swedish heritage, very often rely on software and technology that is already created with other sort of testbeds in mind. And that is not helping in that sense. And then also we have this discussion quite often that, okay, we want to talk about pan-European stories, but that is easier said than done. I mean, there's a lot of conflict and complexity and different names. And very often a collection tends to have the dominant ideology ascribed to it. It's very unlikely that people will sort of account for minorities. I mean, in Sweden, we're very lucky to have that and have national minorities, but very often, this is a sensitive subject, and it is very often the dominant sort of cultures that tend to do this classification and categorization, or at least historically so. So this classification can be often wrong, anachronistic, or culture-specific in a way that we cannot talk about it. And I have two extremely brilliant PhD students, Mo von Bihelberg and Nasrin Mostofian, and they've done a little experiment where they tried to look through collections to see what is the classification and the automatic aggregation of specific words. And it was very interesting to see what they've done, because they went through the sort of Riksantikvarieämbetet, which is the National Heritage Board of Sweden's aggregator. So Google Arts and Culture, but with a Swedish flavor, which is meant to pick from different institutions, different collections under a common denominator, which is a word that describes them. And in this case, it was Persisk kvinna. They wanted to see what exists. And then also, in a way, this particular content management system, this aggregator, it's an aggregator that picks from other content management systems, also picks from European collections when available, right? So it's a very good system. However, when they went through the pictures, they realized that it was not just one, but several photographs, postcards, drawings, and all, where people were misgendered, historically misgendered. So you know, this particular one, I'm just giving you one example, but there's so many, and it was so interesting. But the corresponding description basically says that in Swedish that the motif shows a woman with a dutar, which is an instrument in sort of the Persian court. And of course, the right person in the picture is identifies as a woman and is a woman. The left and the right one, we can only tell that this is a eunuch because they're playing an instrument that is meant to be for men only, and particularly for eunuchs. So if you don't have the domain expert there to sort of sign off and organize, then there is a big problem. I mean, you cannot do this automatically. There will naturally be a lot of mistakes. So they've been working with this sort of data set just to understand. But this is a picture from Stockholm, from, I believe, perhaps the middle of the 19th century, like it's a postcard. And it's in one, but it's two different images. And the information there is anachronistic, incomplete, and incorrect. So that is one example. So in that sense, if we were to say what is also very important is the domain expertise. I mean, I think sort of recently we've been working quite a bit with the question, is AI going to replace this work? Because I mean, if let's say we have a painting that is an expressionist painting, and we don't have a person in-house that is the domain expert to classify it, and there's very little information about its provenance or its aesthetic sort of like classification, if you like, or the type or the style, the centuries, is very difficult to do this work. And in a way, sort of what domain experts hope for is some sort of symbiotic magic sort of jack-in-the-box technology that can solve these problems. But the reality is that the domain expertise is absolutely irreplaceable. And then another additional issue that I'm okay with time. I'm in 37 minutes. I think I will be done in about 5 to 7 minutes. I think that's okay with the time, right? Yeah, no problem. If I get the okay from the organizers, I'm happy. So, I mean, capacity building is one thing, but participation and responsibility is another. So absolutely people can come in as domain experts. But again, it is a question of, there is the expertise, but how do we get together the expertise, the technology, and the sort of like explanation and particulars of a culture together? And I mean, it's really difficult to achieve with off-the-peg classification algorithms. So this has to be trained at a one-to-one basis. And that means that there has to be both participation in the sense that we work on these things together as a group of people that are trying to solve a problem with technologists and curators and researchers, or we sort of, when we assume responsibility for what happens, but also it has to have a participatory nature in the sort of heritage sense that if there is a culture that we don't comprehend or we have no experience of, we cannot sort of make decisions on the spot, which is what AI would do if it doesn't have this information. So that is also something to take into consideration. So speaking about the possibilities, what can it actually do? I mean, we have a book coming up in, I hope, I mean, it's in print now, so it's going in production. Me and my colleague Jan von Borstorff, we wrote a book together for Cambridge for the Small Element series, which is meant to be directed towards professionals in heritage and professionals also in the art sector, the glam sector more generally, as Jan is he's a art historian. So there are possibilities, I mean, to use computer vision. I mean, it's very good with features, right? It's very good with object recognition and facial recognition in new photographs, as well as gestural recognition. And to some extent, you know, in old photographs, it can do some work. But I think the bias is we have to mitigate it in a way, and the historical and context is not part of this. So, and of course, heritage is both, you know, it's people, it's context, is history, is complexity, and that is something that it cannot be done overnight by some machine. So if we were to sort of summarize today's discussion in a way that would make sense, can we actually use AI to open up collections, to make them more inclusive, to give people the possibility to expand on this. And the reality is that we are way above the iceberg. We are not there yet. And I think what we generally recommend, all of us that work in the field, and of course the teams I work with, is that we have to constantly think about three parameters. And one question is that we need to be socially focused when we implement these technologies, because we need to sort of have dialogue between technology. We need to be collaborative. We need to think with human in the loop approaches, or what they call humane AI, which I think is a little bit of a paradox. Then also we need to be ethically focused in the sense that, can we actually mitigate this bias? If there's a picture with a word that does not mean so much today in a positive light, can we all discuss this in a participatory way to share this ambiguity and the vagueness and see how we can actually work with these collections in practice? And then, of course, being inclusive and thinking of the future is one thing, but also thinking about the museum of the future is another thing, which will have to cater to the audiences of the future that may or may not be interested in classification in that sense, but still the work of classification and categorization is so important for us. So as I said, I'm not sure I have the answers, but you can perhaps read some work of mine and think about it further. And I'm really happy to answer any questions today. But I guess my overall point is that, yes, I started with Studio Ghibli, and how sort of everybody is using AI these days. I mean, they released this super powerful sort of generative AI, and people are just turning themselves into Ghibli film characters. I mean, that says a lot about what we think about aesthetics. And I saw somewhere, to some extent, I think there was someone who said that real art is not only about aesthetics, it's not only about style, right? It's also about other things. And these other things, I think, are constantly a process and a question of discussion. And what I'm hoping to do, at least with the group of aesthetic cognitivism, is that we could find ways to sort of rethink about this data that we have, and what can we reach, what point can we reach, and what kind of information can we get about how people see things, and all of the things around aesthetics that's around art and culture. And that's it from me. I think I'm okay with time still, 43 minutes.
We have time for questions. So applause.
Thank you so much.
Okay, if we could stop sharing the screen, we'll move on to questions. So thank you, Anna. Thank you so much for the presentation. We have, Iris, we have a question.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for this. I found it really interesting, particularly given that I have no experience with most of the issues that you talked about. But one thing that really crossed my mind, and I was just wondering, how do you solve this problem if you have any experience with that, is towards the end of your paper when you gave the example of finding something with inappropriate word and then trying to decide how to deal with that. And that kind of seems to be, this is something that I'm quite focused on in my own research now with respect to literature and with respect to films. And what seems to me could be the problem is if we are trying to use these AI tools as a kind of let's say, selection principle or something that will help us get a better sense of our heritage. I was just wondering, how do these choices about the ethical and political aspect of what aspects get to be included in these databases and which are to be excluded, what kind of notion of the heritage is still left once you kind of implement these kinds of decisions into the selection process, if that makes any sense?
I think it's the institutions that pick what they want to keep and what not, and different ones have different lines of work. For example, when it comes to sort of the National Museum in Sweden, which is the art museum, and it's in Stockholm, when I spoke to them 3 years ago, they said that we do not want to, we keep the complicated words in the catalogs, in the actual physical catalogs, but we don't use those in the digital formats, in the digital sort of description of metadata. because we don't want to do that. I don't have an answer to this because I think that personally, because I have come across a lot of complicated words in previous work, especially in relation to the Swedish industrial history and people of color. And there's a lot, and then there's a lot of descriptions of people, like Swedish people, with terms that are used for people of color, but it's not pejorative in the same way, because it sort of reflects on their hairstyle or their curls, or or their skin tone. Or so I'm not sure if things have to be removed or if they should be researched further. I can't really think about that in a way. But perhaps it's different what institutions want and what we researchers want. It's completely different. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Good. Thank you so much, Anna. Really interesting. And I was, of course, reflecting on the things in the studies you were describing in relation to our projects a lot of the time. And I was thinking, of course, of the limitations that you describe in terms of actually, knowing what the images are about in some kind of sense, right? So that the issues about classifications are problematic. The machines get that wrong. We don't always know what it's about. And so AI, machine can't kind of reproduce the images that we want. So there's a lot of places in this process where there is a kind of like a knowledge failure, if you like. But then I thought, okay, well, maybe that's helpful insofar as it does mean that there's a role for us still, and that that kind of individual engagement central to aesthetic experience of things. There's still a role for that. But then my next thought, of course, was that there are plenty of knowledge gaps and knowledge failures in the way we relate to images too, right? I mean, the image that you showed about the Sami family, there's a lot of people around the world who won't recognize, those kind of costumes, or know that yellow, blue, and red are specific colors to that Sami culture, and so on. So to what extent do you think some of the knowledge failures, in AI's kind of connection to these images, are pretty much the same, or reflect or mirror the ones that we have? And that kind of brings us back to that, quote that you started off with, that artificial intelligence maybe isn't so artificial, and maybe it's not so intelligent. Maybe it really is just a reflection of how we relate to images to that extent. Yeah.
It is absolutely the case. I think it's so interesting because, yes, it's completely true. I mean, if I'm not wearing my glasses, I classify all images as wrong. I can't even read. So I guess you don't have to go that far. I mean, the amount of times I got into the wrong train because I read SJ instead of SL in my ticket because I just didn't carry my glass. I mean, it doesn't have to be sort of conscious, these mistakes, but I guess technology is giving us this ubiquity in a way that we are able to sort of put something up, if copyright allows, and ask colleagues and friends, how does this work, for example. So in a way, I think that whereas we may not have always the correct words, I think in our case, when it comes to the aesthetic cognitivism project, maybe it's a little bit easier in the sense that we have documents with text that are readable to some extent. So maybe that's a little bit easier. Again, though, there must be sort of different ways of saying things that may or may not the machines can pick. Like, I mean, there is ambiguity in what is considered a good thing and what not. For example, we said it, I think, before, using the word queer may mean completely different things in a different context. So that, I think, when we get any results of automation, we will be able, hopefully, to review and think through. So I think we really need a human in the process in some way. I think a lot of people talk about AI in terms of existentialism. feeling that, existential, like this is sort of questioning how I think about the world. I was also thinking it could also test those sort of fault lines of how we think and perhaps be creative. I mean, we could even reverse the argument. Let's say we use sort of a review of a music, sort of an opera, to create another piece of art with generative AI. How would that come out? That also might be an interesting way, just to know in what ways can it be creative and in what ways can it actually reflect what we think. I always refer back to the Langen langage sort of argument, like Ferdinand de Saussure, that you have a significant and a signifier, and sometimes it's not, they don't necessarily sort of are the same for all people. The signifier, I mean, but yeah, I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but I think that's where the experts are needed. So we are still valid. We are not obsolete.
Thank you. Eileen.
Yeah, thanks. This is really interesting and hard to think about. And one, I want to just, I wish you would come and talk to people at my university, because we got this email this week that talked about our vision for the future, which is to have AI seamlessly integrate with teaching, research, administration, whatever. And that's kind of not, I want it not to be seamless, I want us to know that we're using it. So that's one thing. I feel like you're reflecting on it in a way that's useful. Like, I want us, like, in terms of knowing what we're doing, we should know when this is feeding into it. But really what I wanted to say is I can't remember how you defined heritage at the beginning, but I feel like part of what you're discussing makes me think about that. Like, what are we going to inherit in the future? Like, I feel like we're going to inherit this huge buildup of the products of AI. And I want to say, that isn't what I meant by heritage. Like, so it's making me want to think, like, what's a good way for things to be generated that then we can say that's our heritage?
I mean, it's great when it works with restoration, not with every restoration, but restoration preservation sort of is the big, it can really help. I mean, especially, I mean, there's exceptional projects in Sweden. There's this sort of Gothenburg-led project of restoring all of the Ukrainian sort of churches. There is projects that deal with sort of restoring text and sort of like looking at fragmented. There's quite a lot of that, and it's very positive. But I think, the classification and categorization in particular doesn't always work. I mean, we are just publishing another article now where we use the collection of sub-Saharan African photography and try to mitigate gender and sort of like age bias. And then we use architectural elements to do the same. So pictures of architectural elements. And of course, there's not a big difference between the two if you train, but you get a maximum of 80% accuracy in all the results. It's never 100%. And then you have to spend a lot of time fine-tuning the algorithm to get to that point. So I'm not sure if it's even worth it. I jokingly say, just get the master student with 5 liters of coffee, and they will do a better job, and they will, but it would be, I mean, the curators, I mean, it would be fantastic if they can have the possibility to have some sort of automated process that will not, they can do other things then, focus on other things, because, I mean, these places are also very severely understaffed most of the time. I mean, I spoke to Malmo Museum a week ago, I was there, and they have 6 people, 6 employees, and it's a huge collection, enormous, of everything from archaeological sort of sites to human remains to taxidermic, and there's museums like that, and they really want to have a catalog to know what they have because it helps them, but not so easy automated. Yeah, sorry, I can go on for hours. We can only speculate, I guess.
Thank you. Guy.
Thank you, Anna. That was fascinating. as expected, must say. So the map you showed of how AI sees the world in terms of statistical bias with this hugely inflated United States of America and all the other kind of like very technologically advanced societies similarly kind of like inflated. Is fascinating, obviously, as well as it's kind of like, well, that's where the data comes from, so it's kind of common sense at the same time. But I was really interested, A, by the way you discussed it, and B, by the chart that you reproduced from your really exciting sounding book with Jan van Bonsdorff, where in your gradation of like possible, could be possible, I can't remember exactly how, and then not possible. Bias recognition was mostly in not going to be possible.
No.
I just wondered because, like we humans, obviously, you know, like bias is something. It's just like it's part of our perceptual. It's built into our perception. We into our perception. We pick out things that are salient for us, and so everything revolves around us to a certain extent, and then to our cultural milieu. And in a way, machines ought to be much better at avoiding bias than we are, because you can simply send them instructions. For example, just in terms of whatever the information is, if it's kind of comparison around the whole world, they can, you know, take the bias in their current data set, which is represented in that map, and just say, okay, you have to accommodate this bias by statistically exaggerating the results that come, for example, countries in Africa.
Yeah, I mean, it can be absolutely mitigated, but it's mitigated to a point. It's not mitigated always 100%. Replacing is one thing, but sort of like it could be. I'll try to give you an example. Let's say you have let's say you have a catalog of artifacts, and they are in sort of literally spreadsheets that are handwritten. And there is pejorative words all over. Like you could say, avoid this and this and this and this and this words and replace them with this and this and this words. That's very easy to do. But the problem begins when you don't have already structured information so much. When information is in different entries, for example. I mean, you might say, yeah, just please erase the color description in that, but the color description could be in a completely other column, or it could be described with a word that is historical that no one is using. In this case, you know, you have these kinds of things. I mean, it could be, please eliminate all of that. Is very easy if you have structured data, but if it's not structured correctly, and also it's the other issue is that AI cannot lie, really. But it will make things up. It will hallucinate. So, you know, the amount of times we asked for it to sort of, I mean, when it comes to Gen AI, I mean, if you the beginning, if you typed, now I don't know how it is with this particular program anymore, but if you typed, you know, show me the picture of a scientist, it would be a man in a lab, white. It's just how it is, you know, because this is sort of the trained data sets. And I was at the conference I was right now, there was one example of a script, like a written script process called Script City, where I think that particular scholar had programmed a whole group of authors and I mean, you know, he had used actual people to train systems to have, and still there were problems with the representation. So they wrote the script, and he also generated a discussion between those people that were completely fictional, but based on, you know, programming on real people, and it was still problematic. I mean, still didn't make so much sense. So I think these are problems with the timeline. I think bias is a problem with the timeline. But now mitigation is possible, but not always.
Wonderful.
We've reached the hour mark, and this is the point at which people begin to leave. So before you do, let me say two things. On May 8th, we will meet again. Karl Plantinga will read a paper, present research on character engagement and moral understanding in screen stories. We can linger for a minute if anyone has more questions, but we should thank Anna for this extremely interesting talk. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's so much
your
fun.
research with us.
Thank you for listening to this recorded seminar from the research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. To find out more about the project, please go to our website www.aestheticcognitivism.com.